The storm pounds the ancient stone walls, lightning splits the sky, and the lonely duke, mocked by nobles as the virgin at 40, hears a desperate knock at his gate. A poor girl, soaked to the bone, pleads for one night of shelter. Against every rule of class and custom, he opens his castle doors. But inside these walls, kindness sparks scandal. Whispers echo in the halls. The girl dares to defend him against jeering lords, and her words ignite a fire that threatens to consume them both. His cousin sharpens his schemes. The church raises its warning. And still, the duke's heart burns with something he has never known before. When compassion becomes a weapon, when love defies centuries of blood and birth, how far will he go to protect her? And can the virgin duke cast aside fear before the world tears them apart forever? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. Thunder shook the ancient stones of Kentmere Castle as Duke Alistair Harrow sat alone in the vast dining hall. The flames of dozens of candles flickered in their silver holders, casting dancing shadows across the empty chairs and untouched place settings. Outside, the autumn storm raged with a fury that matched the darkness of the night. The Duke cut a solitary figure at the head of the long oak table, his fork scraping quietly against fine porcelain as he took measured bites of his evening meal. At 40 years of age, his handsome features remained unmarked by dissipation or excess, yet a deep melancholy seemed etched in the corners of his eyes. In the kitchen below, the servants whispered among themselves as they went about their duties. "Poor soul, dining all alone again," murmured the cook, shaking her head as she stirred a pot of soup. "'Tis no wonder they call him the Virgin Duke," a young scullery maid whispered back, earning herself a sharp look from the housekeeper. "Mind your tongue, girl," the older woman scolded. "His Grace may keep to himself, but he's a good master fair with his tenants and generous to those in need." Upstairs, Alistair paid no mind to the quiet rustling of servants as dishes were cleared away. He had grown accustomed to the solitude, finding comfort in his books and prayers rather than the endless social whirl of London society. Yet on nights like these, when wind howled through the castle's corridors like lost souls, even he felt the weight of his isolation. A tremendous crack of thunder rattled the leaded glass windows, making even the stoic Duke start slightly in his chair. The sound had barely faded when an urgent pounding echoed from the castle's main gates. "Your Grace?" The steward, Harrison, appeared in the doorway, his usually composed face betraying alarm. "There's someone at the gate in this weather." "Then let them in, Harrison," Alistair replied calmly, rising from his chair. "But sir, at this hour it could be anyone. Highwayman, or it could be someone in desperate need," the Duke countered, his voice firm but gentle. "Open the gates." Harrison bowed stiffly and hurried to comply, though his disapproval was clear in every line of his rigid posture. Alistair followed at a measured pace, reaching the entrance hall just as the great doors creaked open. A gust of wind and rain swept in, and with it came a figure who collapsed to the marble floor. It was a young woman, her sodden clothes clinging to her shivering form. Her dark skin stood out starkly against the pale stone as she raised her face to the Duke, revealing features both beautiful and marked by exhaustion. "Please," she gasped, water dripping from her hair. "I beg your shelter, my lord. I'm Grace, a maid from Thornfield Hall. I've walked for hours in this storm." Harrison's face darkened with suspicion. "The servant's entrance is around back now," Alistair interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that silenced the steward instantly. He studied the young woman's face, seeing not her station or her color, but the dignity that shone through her desperate state. "Show her to the blue guest chamber in the east wing." The guest wing? Harrison sputtered. But sir, she's clearly a servant. The proper place would be, is below stairs? Alistair finished, his tone growing stern. No soul should be left to the mercy of such a storm, Harrison. We are all God's children, regardless of our station. His expression softened as he turned back to Grace. You will be safe here tonight, miss. Grace's eyes widened in surprise and gratitude, though Alistair could see fear still lingering in their depths. Fear, perhaps, of the scandal her presence might cause, or of the judgment she already faced from the steward's disapproving frown. Thank you, Your Grace, she whispered, clutching a small bundle to her chest as she was helped to her feet. Harrison summoned a maid, who led Grace toward the grand staircase, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. As she ascended the worn stone steps, Grace couldn't help glancing back at the Duke, who stood watching her departure with an unreadable expression. Her heart pounded with equal measures of relief and trepidation, knowing that while she had found shelter from the storm without, she might have walked into a tempest of a different sort within these ancient walls. The first pale light of dawn crept through the tall windows, casting a gentle glow across the finest bedchamber Grace had ever seen. She lay still for a moment, scarcely daring to breathe as she took in the elegance surrounding her, the carved wooden bedposts reaching toward the ceiling, the thick tapestries adorning the walls, and the cold hearth where only ashes remained of last night's fire. The bed linens were softer than anything she had known, smelling of lavender and fresh air. Such luxury made her previous position as a maid seem a lifetime away. Her fingers traced the delicate embroidery on the coverlet as memories of the previous night's storm slowly faded. Below stairs, the kitchen buzzed with morning activity and whispered conversations. Did you hear? His Grace put her in the blue chamber, not the servants' quarters. One maid whispered over fresh-baked bread and morning ale. Most peculiar, replied the housekeeper, her lips pursed in disapproval. The Duke's charity knows no bounds, but there must be limits to propriety. Perhaps he's finally softening, suggested the cook, kneading dough with practiced hands. Heaven knows this great house needs a woman's touch. Their gossip was interrupted by the steward's arrival. The Duke requests the guest presence at breakfast, he announced stiffly. See that she's properly dressed and escorted to the morning room. Grace's heart fluttered as she was led downstairs, now wearing a simple but clean dress provided by the housekeeper. The morning room was warm and bright, sunlight streaming through tall windows that overlooked the rain-washed gardens. Duke Alistair stood as she entered, his tall frame cutting an impressive figure against the morning light. Good morrow, he said softly. I trust you slept well? Yes, Your Grace. I thank you for your great kindness. Grace curtsied deeply, careful to mind her manners, despite her racing heart. They sat at a small table laid with fine china and silver. As they broke their fast with fresh bread, eggs, and tea, the Duke studied her with gentle curiosity. Pray tell me, he began carefully, what circumstances led to your dismissal from your former household? Grace's hands stilled in her lap. Taking a steadying breath, she met his gaze directly. The mistress accused me of stealing ribbon, Your Grace, but I speak true when I say I never touched it. She found it later in her own sewing box, but by then... She shook her head slightly, her voice steady, despite the pain of the memory. Alistair watched her closely, struck by the quiet dignity in her bearing. Here was no cowering servant spinning tales, but a woman of remarkable poise, speaking her truth without embellishment or excuse. Something stirred in his chest, admiration, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit who valued honor above all. Their quiet breakfast was interrupted by the announcement of visitors. Lord Pembroke and Baron Ashworth swept into the morning room without waiting to be properly announced, their fine clothes and loud voices filling the peaceful space with unwelcome energy. "Harrow, still breaking your fast alone, I see." Lord Pembroke's booming voice carried no true warmth. Grace slipped quietly away as the nobles approached, but remained within earshot as she paused near the half-open door. "Come now, Alistair," drawled Baron Ashworth, helping himself to tea without invitation. "When will you end this monkish existence of yours?" The Tun still whispers about the Virgin Duke of Kentmere. Cruel laughter followed his words. "Indeed. One might think you've taken holy orders rather than a dukedom." Through the gap in the door, Grace saw the Duke's face remain impassive, though a muscle tightened in his jaw. Her hands clenched at her sides as she listened to their continued mockery of this man who had shown her such kindness. Something fierce and protective woke in her heart. The Duke's quiet dignity deserved better than to be trampled by these preening peacocks. Though she was but a former maid seeking shelter, she would not stand idle while they sought to diminish him. Silent determination filled her as she straightened her spine, already forming plans to defend the honor of the man who had opened his home to her in her hour of need. The great hall of Kentmere Castle blazed with firelight, warming the ancient stones as afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor. Two visiting nobles, Lord Blackwood and Sir James Pennington, lounged near the massive hearth, their voices carrying through the spacious chamber as servants moved quietly about their duties. "Come now, Harrow," Lord Blackwood called out, swirling amber spirits in a crystal glass. "Surely you tire of this solitary existence? A man of your station ought to have produced an heir by now." Duke Alistair stood rigid before the fire, his face a careful mask. "My private affairs are my own concern, my lord." Sir James gave a harsh laugh. "Private indeed. The Virgin Duke keeps to himself so well, one wonders if he knows what to do with a woman at all." "I wager 10 guineas he has never even kissed a maid," Blackwood declared, his voice thick with wine and mockery. "What say you, Pennington? Shall we open a book on when our virtuous friend might finally know a woman's embrace?" Their cruel laughter echoed off the stone walls. Servants kept their eyes lowered, scurrying past with trays and linens, but Grace, who had paused in the doorway with fresh kindling, felt her cheeks burn with indignation. The Duke stood alone against their taunts, his shoulders straight but his eyes shadowed with quiet pain. Something inside her snapped. Before she could think better of it, Grace stepped into the hall, her plain dress a stark contrast to the noble's fine attire. "Your pardon, my lords," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her thundering heart, "but I must speak." The nobles turned, startled by this breach of protocol. Duke Alistair's eyes widened slightly, but he made no move to silence her. Any woman of true virtue would count herself blessed to share his Grace's life, Grace declared, her hands clasped tightly before her. His kindness and honor mark him as a true nobleman, not these cruel jests at his expense. A shocked silence fell over the hall. Then Lord Blackwood's face twisted with disdain. "Well, the little maid has spirit, it seems. Perhaps our Virgin Duke has found himself a champion, though hardly one of suitable breeding." Servants who had frozen in their tasks now hurried away, whispering behind their hands. Sir James rose sneering. "This tale will make fine sport at tomorrow's hunt. The Duke of Kentmere, defended by a common servant girl." Duke Alistair stepped forward then, his expression grave but composed. "Miss Grace," he said quietly, offering his arm with perfect courtesy, "allow me to escort you from the hall." Grace's cheeks flamed as she accepted his guidance. feeling the weight of every stare as they walked from the great hall. In the corridor, the Duke paused, but spoke no word of rebuke. He merely bowed slightly and turned away, leaving her trembling with the enormity of what she had done. Throughout the long afternoon, whispers raced through every corner of Kentmere Castle. Maids huddled in corners, discussing the shocking scene. Footmen carried the tale to the stables, where grooms shook their heads at such impropriety. In the kitchen, the cook declared it would bring nothing but trouble, while her helpers sighed romantically over Grace's courage. As evening descended, Duke Alistair stood alone in his private chamber, gazing up at the portrait of his mother that hung above the mantel. The Dowager Duchess looked down with painted eyes that seemed to hold both wisdom and gentle reproach. She had always counseled him to uphold the dignity of their line, to remember that duty must guide a nobleman's heart. Yet now, standing in the firelight, Alistair found his carefully ordered world shifting beneath his feet. Grace's defense of his honor had awakened something he had never allowed himself to feel, a warmth that had nothing to do with duty or title. Her courage and genuine concern for his dignity stirred emotions he had long denied existed. He touched the frame of his mother's portrait, remembering her final words about finding happiness beyond the bounds of convention. The flickering candlelight cast shadows across his features, as he stood suspended between the obligations of his title and the unprecedented stirring in his heart. The morning sun cast gentle shadows across Kentmere's walled garden as Grace moved between the herb beds, her fingers brushing against woody stems of lavender and thyme. The autumn air held a crisp bite, making her pull her worn shawl closer. She knelt to pluck withered leaves from a rosemary bush, her mind still dwelling on the events of yesterday in the great hall. The soft crunch of boots on gravel made her turn. Duke Alistair approached, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the frost-tinged grass. Grace quickly rose, dropping into a curtsy. "Your Grace, please," he said softly, "do not let me disturb your work." His eyes held none of the stern reserve she'd expected after her bold defense of him. Instead, they carried a warmth that made her heart flutter. "I was only tidying the herbs, Your Grace. The garden needs preparation for winter. You know of herbcraft?" He moved closer, studying the neat beds with interest. "My mother taught me, Your Grace. She served as an herbalist to our village before." Grace trailed off, the old grief catching in her throat. "Before she passed?" His voice held gentle understanding. When Grace nodded, he continued, "My own mother found solace in this garden. She would spend hours here, reading or simply sitting in contemplation. It is a peaceful place." Grace agreed, then ventured carefully, "Do you not find the castle's grandeur lonely at times, Your Grace?" Alistair's expression softened. "Indeed. Though surrounded by servants and visitors, true companionship is rare in noble circles. Many seek favor or advantage. Few seek genuine friendship. Yet surely faith provides comfort?" Grace asked, thinking of her own solace in prayer. "You are religious?" His eyebrows rose with interest. "Yes, Your Grace. The village vicar, he." She hesitated, then continued, "He taught me to read, using Bible verses. My greatest treasure is a small prayer book he gifted me." Alistair's face lit up. "You read? That is remarkable. What else have you studied?" "Whatever I could find, Your Grace." The vicar had a modest library, Timaeus, histories, poetry, even some philosophy, though much was beyond my understanding. "Knowledge seeks worthy vessels, regardless of station," Alistair said warmly. Would you care to walk with me? The morning air is fine." And so began a daily ritual. Each morning, weather permitting, Grace would meet the Duke in the garden. They walked the gravel paths, discussing books they had read, sharing thoughts on faith and virtue. Sometimes they simply walked in comfortable silence, watching leaves spiral down from the ancient oaks. The servants' disapproving whispers grew with each passing day. Maids huddled in corners, trading shocked observations of their master's unprecedented behavior. The steward's face grew more pinched, his bow more rigid, each time he observed the Duke and the common-born woman deep in conversation. But Alistair seemed not to notice, or perhaps chose not to care. His reserved manner gradually softened in Grace's presence. She discovered he possessed a gentle wit, and the sound of his quiet laughter began to warm their morning walks. When Grace spoke of her hopes and fears, he listened with genuine interest, offering thoughtful responses that showed he valued her perspective. One evening, as autumn's early darkness crept across the garden, they lingered by the herb beds where they had first truly spoken. Grace's knowledge of plants had proven useful. Under her care, the kitchen garden flourished despite the advancing season. "I must attend to my duties, Your Grace," Grace said reluctantly as the light faded. She curtsied and turned toward the servants' entrance, her figure graceful despite her simple dress. Alistair watched her go, his heart full of unfamiliar emotions. In the growing darkness, he whispered words meant only for himself. There walks more true nobility than half the lords in Parliament. The garden seemed emptier without her presence, but her warmth lingered in his mind like the last rays of the setting Sunday. The gilded carriage rattled through Kentmere's gates on a crisp autumn morning, its polished surface gleaming like a peacock among sparrows. Lord Edmund Harrow descended with practiced grace, his silk waistcoat and perfectly powdered wig marking him as every inch the fashionable nobleman. The servants scrambled to attend him, though his warm smile never quite reached his cool gray eyes. "Cousin Alistair," Edmund called out, spreading his arms wide as the Duke emerged from the castle. "How good it is to see you again. Though I must say, the countryside has not improved your fashion sense." He gestured at Alistair's simple dark coat with a laugh that seemed more mockery than mirth. Alistair received his cousin with proper courtesy, though his shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "Welcome to Kentmere, Edmund. I trust your journey was comfortable?" "As comfortable as these provincial roads allow," Edmund replied, following Alistair into the great hall. He paused, noting a figure in the garden through the window. Grace, tending to the herbs as had become her morning custom. More interesting still was how his cousin's gaze lingered on her for just a moment too long. Throughout the day, Edmund watched. He observed how Alistair and Grace walked together in the garden, their conversation flowing with an ease that belied their different stations. He noted how the Duke leaned slightly closer when she spoke, how his stern features softened at her gentle laughter. Most telling was how Grace carried herself, MBZ, not with a servant's deference but with quiet dignity. That evening, as candles flickered in their silver holders and servants brought out the third course, Edmund struck with the precision of a practiced courtier. "Tell me, Miss Grace," he said, swirling his wine, "from which family do you claim descent? I find myself quite curious about your background." Grace's hand stilled on her cutlery. "I make no claims to noble birth, my lord. My father was a carpenter, my mother a herbalist." "How fascinating," Edmund drawled. "And yet here you sit, dining with a duke. One might wonder what attractions have earned you such unprecedented favor." His words dripped with insinuation. Color rose in Grace's cheeks, though she held her head high. "His Grace has shown me Christian charity, nothing more. If you'll excuse me, my lords." She rose with as much dignity as she could muster and left the dining room, her steps quickening as she reached the door. That is quite enough." Alistair's voice cut through the air like steel. He stood, towering over the table, his face dark with anger. "You forget yourself, cousin. Miss Grace is under my protection, and I will not have her insulted in my home." Edmund raised his hands in mock surrender. "My dear cousin, I merely express the concerns any caring family member would have. Surely you must see how unusual your situation appears?" "What I see," Alistair replied coldly, "is that you would do well to remember that you are a guest in my house." With that, he strode from the room, leaving Edmund alone with his wine and his schemes. Later that night, in the privacy of his chambers, Edmund sat at a delicate writing desk, his quill scratching across expensive paper. His letters were masterpieces of subtle malice, each one carefully crafted to spread through society like poison. To the Duchess of Marlborough, most concerning reports from Kentmere. Of our dear Duke, quite enchanted by a common maid. One fears for his reputation. To Lord Pembroke, the Virgin Duke, it seems, may soon shed his title, though perhaps not in the way society might have hoped. A scandal brewing. To Lady Ashworth, one wonders what spells this creature has woven. Perhaps you might wish to pay a call, to see for yourself. Edmund's cold smile grew as he melted the red wax, pressing his seal into each letter with deliberate care. The candlelight caught the gleam in his eyes as he arranged the letters in a neat stack, each one a seed of destruction waiting to be sown across the countryside. In the flickering light, his shadow loomed against the wall like a predator preparing to strike. The church bells of St. Matthew's rang clear across the autumn morning, their deep tones calling the faithful to worship. Nobles in their fine carriages and villagers on foot made their way through the churchyard, where fallen leaves crunched beneath their steps. Inside the ancient stone walls, candles flickered in brass holders, casting dancing shadows on the weathered walls. Duke Alistair Harrow sat alone in the elevated Duke's pew, his broad shoulders straight, despite the weight of whispers that followed his every move. 3 rows behind the household servants, Grace kept her eyes fixed on her worn prayer book, though her heart ached with each glimpse of his solitary figure. The Bishop of Kentmere's sermon rang with unusual force that morning, his words about proper order and divine hierarchy falling like hammer blows through the hushed sanctuary. "Let each remain in their appointed station," he intoned, his stern gaze sweeping the congregation. "For it is through acceptance of God's design that we find true peace." As the congregation filed out after the final hymn, a young acolyte approached the Duke with a bow. "Your Grace, the bishop requests your presence in his study." The boy's voice quavered slightly. "At once, if it please you." Alistair nodded gravely and followed the boy through a small side door. The bishop's study was warm with firelight, but the welcome ended there. Bishop Kentmere stood with his back to the hearth, his face cast in shadow. "Your Grace," the bishop began, his tone carefully measured, "I speak not only as your spiritual shepherd, but as one who holds your family in highest regard." He paused, fingers tracing the gold cross at his throat. "This situation with the maid cannot continue." Alistair's jaw tightened. "I was not aware that Christian charity had become a sin, Your Excellency. Charity is one thing, but the girl's continued presence in your household, the daily walks, the intimate conversations." The bishop's voice hardened. "It breeds scandal and undermines the very foundations of proper society. Unless she is dismissed, I fear the Church must take action." "What action?" Alistair's voice was quiet but steady. "We would have no choice but to refuse you communion." The bishop's words fell like stones in still water. "And if the situation persists, excommunication could follow. Consider your immortal soul, Your Grace, and hers." Outside the heavy oak door, Grace stood frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle any sound. She had come to deliver a message to the bishop's housekeeper. But now those terrible words echoed in her mind. She fled down the corridor, her footsteps masked by the thick carpet, her heart breaking with each step. That evening, as clouds gathered over Kentmere Castle, Alistair summoned Grace to his study. She found him standing by the window, his figure outlined against the darkening sky. When he turned, the pain in his eyes made her breath catch. "Grace," he said softly, "you must leave Kentmere." Though she had expected these words since the morning, they still struck like physical blows. "I understand, Your Grace." "No," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You do not. I would brave any scandal, bear any mockery, to keep you near. But I cannot be the cause of your ruination. The Church's censure would mark you forever, destroy any hope of future position or security." "And your soul?" Grace whispered. "Would you risk that too?" Alistair's hands clenched at his sides. "I find myself wondering if my soul has truly been at risk since you arrived, or if perhaps it has never been more alive." He crossed to his desk and withdrew a small leather purse. "This will see you safely to London, where opportunities are greater." His voice faltered. "I wish things were different." Grace accepted the purse with trembling fingers. "As do I, Your Grace, as do I." In the gray hours before dawn, Grace slipped out through the servants' gate, carrying only a small bundle of belongings. The cobblestones were slick with overnight rain as she paused to look back at the castle's towers, now fading into the mist. Her tears fell silently, joining the dampness underfoot as she turned away from all she had come to love. The halls of Kentmere Castle grew silent as autumn deepened into a bitter chill. Days passed like shadows, each one grayer than the last. Where once there had been quiet contentment in the ancient stone corridors, now only emptiness echoed. Even the usual bustle of servants seemed muted, their whispered conversations centered on their master's melancholy. "His Grace hasn't touched his soup again," murmured the kitchen maid to the cook, lifting away another barely touched bowl. "3 days now, he's eaten no more than a bird." In the great dining hall, Alistair sat alone at the massive oak table, candlelight flickering across his drawn features. The steward hovered anxiously nearby, watching as the Duke pushed away yet another plate of untouched food. Dark circles shadowed Alistair's eyes, speaking of sleepless nights spent pacing the castle's empty chambers. One crisp morning, Alistair found himself drawn to the walled garden where he and Grace had shared so many conversations. The herb beds lay dormant now, waiting for spring's return. As he walked the familiar paths, something white caught his eye among the twisting branches of an old hedge. His heart clenched as he carefully extracted a delicate handkerchief, recognizing the neat stitching in one corner, Grace's careful handiwork. He pressed the soft fabric between his fingers, remembering how she had smiled as she told him about learning to sew from her mother. The scent of lavender still clung faintly to the cloth, and Alistair closed his eyes against a sudden sting of tears. Meanwhile, in the village, Grace had found unexpected sanctuary with Mistress Willett, a kindly widow who lived in a small but tidy cottage near the village square. The older woman had taken one look at Grace's tear-stained face and opened her door without question. "There's always room at my hearth for a soul in need," Mistress Willett had declared, ushering Grace inside. "And my grandson Thomas could use someone to keep him out of mischief while I tend to my washing work." Grace earned her keep through careful needlework, mending torn shirts and darning stockings for village families. Her gentle manner soon won her the affection of 8-year-old Thomas, who delighted in helping her gather herbs and listening to the stories she told while working. "Tell me again about the castle," Thomas would beg, sitting at her feet as she sewed. "About the great hall with all the paintings, and the garden with the stone walls." But Grace never spoke of the Duke himself, though her heart ached with every memory. In the village tavern, tongues wagged freely over mugs of ale. "The Duke's not been the same since that maid left," declared the blacksmith's wife. "Saw him yesterday riding past, looking like a ghost." "Pride's a cold bedfellow," agreed the tavern keeper, wiping down his counter. "Any fool can see he's pining for her." The words reached even to Kentmere Castle, where Alistair struggled with thoughts that gave him no peace. In his private study, he stared at the books they had discussed together, remembering how Grace's eyes had lit up at discovering his collection of poetry. His vow of chastity, once a source of righteous satisfaction, now felt like iron chains around his heart. Walking the castle battlements one evening, Alistair watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. Below in the village, smoke rose from cottage chimneys, including the widow Willett's, where he knew Grace now lived. The distance between them seemed at once vast and painfully small. The chapel was dark and cold when Alistair entered that night, only the eternal flame before the altar providing any light. He knelt on the hard stone floor, his shoulders bowing under the weight of his turmoil. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I have lived by my vows, denied earthly pleasure, sought only to serve you in purity." He pressed his forehead against his clasped hands. But is virtue truly found in denial or in love? Only silence answered, broken by the soft sputter of the chapel flame and the whisper of his own ragged breathing. Winter descended upon the village with an iron grip, coating the cobblestones with treacherous frost and sending bitter winds whistling through every crack and crevice. Grace hurried home from the market, her basket clutched close, her worn cloak pulled tight against the biting cold. The setting sun cast long shadows across the snow-dusted lane as she approached Mistress Willett's modest cottage. The moment she opened the door, she knew something was wrong. Mistress Willett's face was drawn with worry as she bent over her grandson's bed. "Thank heavens you're back," the older woman whispered, wringing her hands. "Thomas has taken ill, burning up like a furnace, he is." Grace rushed to the bedside, setting down her basket. The boy lay curled beneath a pile of blankets, his usually bright face flushed with fever, his breathing labored and wheezy. When she placed her hand on his forehead, the heat radiating from his skin made her heart clench with fear. "How long has he been like this?" Grace asked, already rolling up her sleeves. "The fever came on sudden-like, just after midday," Mistress Willett replied, her voice trembling. "He was playing in the snow yesterday. Wouldn't come in despite my scolding." Grace's mind raced through the healing knowledge her mother had passed down to her precious wisdom from generations of women who had tended the sick with careful hands and loving hearts. "We need mustard powder," she declared, "and plenty of clean cloths. Have you any chicken bones for broth?" Through the long night, Grace worked tirelessly. She mixed mustard plasters with steady hands, laying them carefully across Thomas's chest to ease his breathing. Every hour, she spooned warm broth between his cracked lips, whispering encouragement when he stirred fitfully. Between these tasks, she prayed, her soft words mixing with the crackling of the hearth fire. Mistress Willett dozed fitfully in her chair, exhausted from worry. Dawn was breaking when she awoke to find Grace still at her post, singing quietly to Thomas as she bathed his face with cool water. "You're an angel," the older woman murmured, tears in her eyes. "A true angel." Word of Grace's devotion spread through the village like wildfire. Women gathering at the well spoke of how she hadn't left the boy's side for 2 days straight. The baker's wife brought fresh bread unasked, and the butcher's boy appeared with soup bones just because. Even the vicar stopped by to offer prayers and praise for her Christian charity. These whispers reached Kentmere Castle, carried by servants who still held Grace in high regard. When Duke Alistair heard of the child's desperate condition and Grace's tireless vigil, something shifted in his carefully ordered world. Without a word to his disapproving steward, he ordered his carriage prepared. The grand vehicle looked oddly out of place before Mistress Willet's humble door. Alistair stepped down, his fine boots crunching in the snow, and ducked through the low entrance. The sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Grace sat in a worn wooden chair beside the small bed, cradling Thomas against her shoulder. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, and shadows marked the skin beneath her eyes. Yet she glowed with an inner light that took Alistair's breath away. She was singing softly an old hymn his own mother had once sung while rubbing gentle circles on the boy's back. Thomas's breathing, though still labored, had eased somewhat. His small hand clutched Grace's shawl as she rocked him, her entire being focused on bringing comfort to this suffering child. She seemed unaware of the Duke's presence, lost in her task of loving care. Alistair stood transfixed in the doorway, watching this tableau of pure, selfless devotion. The morning light streaming through the window cast a golden halo around Grace and the child, and in that moment, all the accusations and scandals that had driven them apart seemed to crumble into meaningless dust. "This is no temptress," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "This is a saint." Through frosted window panes, winter sunlight streamed into the village church, casting rainbow patterns through the stained glass onto the worn stone floor. The small chapel was unusually full this morning, packed with both common folk and nobility who had come to give thanks for young Tommy Willet's recovery. The boy himself sat rosy-cheeked beside his grandmother, no trace remaining of the fever that had nearly claimed him. Grace slipped quietly into the back of the church, taking her place in the servants' pew. Her simple wool dress marked her station, but there was a quiet dignity in her bearing as she knelt in prayer. The villagers who passed by touched her shoulder or whispered words of gratitude. It was her careful nursing, after all, that had brought the child through his ordeal. The Bishop of Kentmere stood at the pulpit, his rich vestments gleaming in the winter light as he led the congregation in prayer. "Let us give thanks for the mercy shown to young Thomas Willet," he intoned, his voice echoing off the ancient stones. Duke Alistair Harrow sat alone in the ducal pew, his tall frame rigid with an inner tension that few noticed. As the bishop began his sermon, Alistair's hands gripped the wooden pew before him, his knuckles white with determination. The morning light caught the silver threading in his dark coat, and his face bore an expression of one who had reached a momentous decision. Without warning, he rose to his feet. The sudden movement drew every eye in the church, and even the bishop fell silent mid-sentence. Alistair stepped into the center aisle, his boots echoing on the flagstones. "Your Grace?" the bishop questioned, his tone sharp with surprise. "Forgive my interruption." Alistair's voice rang clear and strong through the hushed church, "but I must speak." He turned to face the congregation, his gaze sweeping over nobles and villagers alike before settling on Grace. "I stand before you all to declare my intentions toward Miss Grace, who has shown herself to be a woman of true virtue." A wave of gasps rippled through the church. Lady Pembroke dropped her prayer book with a clatter. Lord Edmund, skulking in a side pew, turned purple with outrage. "I intend to make her my wife," Alistair continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Her nobility of spirit far outweighs any accident of birth. She has shown more Christian charity in her brief time among us than many who boast ancient titles." The bishop stepped down from his pulpit, his face thunderous. "Your Grace, this is most irregular." But he was interrupted by a sudden cheer from the back of the church. It was Mistress Willett who had started it, rising to her feet with Tommy in her arms. "God bless you both," she cried out. "She saved my grandson when no one else could." The cheer was taken up by other villagers. The baker whose children Grace had taught letters to, the weaver whose sick wife she had tended, the farmers who had seen her share her meager bread with hungry children. Alistair strode down the aisle to where Grace sat, her face pale with emotion. He extended his hand to her, and in that moment, the difference in their stations seemed to melt away like frost in the morning. Sunday. The bishop watched the scene unfold, his expression shifting from outrage to calculation. The people's voice was clear. They loved this humble maid who had served them so well. To deny the match would risk their goodwill, and the church could ill afford to lose the common people's support. "Your Grace," the bishop said at last, his tone carefully measured, "given the unusual circumstances, and your position as patron of this parish, I shall grant a special license for the marriage." Grace looked up at Alistair's outstretched hand, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. The church had fallen silent, waiting for her response. She thought of all the barriers between them: birth, station, custom, the prejudices of society. But she also thought of their shared walks in the garden, their conversations about books and faith, the quiet understanding that had grown between them. Her voice was soft but clear as she placed her hand in his. "If God permits," she whispered, her words carrying in the hushed church, "then so shall I." The winter morning dawned crisp and bright over Kentmere Castle, its ancient stones glowing golden in the early light. Inside the castle chapel, hundreds of beeswax candles flickered, their warm light reflecting off the holly berries that decorated every windowsill and arch. The scent of pine boughs and sacred incense filled the air, creating an atmosphere both festive and holy. Noble guests filed in wearing their finest winter velvets and furs, their expressions a mixture of resigned acceptance and lingering disapproval. But they were far outnumbered by the villagers, dressed in their Sunday best, their faces bright with joy as they squeezed into the chapel's wooden pews. Duke Alistair Harrow stood before the altar, his tall frame straight and proud in a coat of midnight blue velvet. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he adjusted his lace cuffs. The years of solitude that had earned him his infamous nickname seemed to fall away like an old cloak as he waited for his bride. When the chapel doors opened, a collective murmur rose from the gathered crowd. Grace entered on Mistress Willett's arm, wearing a gown of cream-colored wool, simply cut but elegant in its clean lines. Her dark curls were crowned with a circlet of winter roses, and she carried a bouquet of holly and white heather. Though her gown was modest compared to the silk-clad noble ladies, she moved with such natural grace that none could doubt her worthiness to become a duchess. Alistair's breath caught in his throat as he watched her approach. Tears glistened in his eyes, though his smile never wavered. Each step Grace took down the aisle seemed to erase another year of his isolation, another shadow of his loneliness. The Bishop of Kentmere, who had finally made his peace with the match, stood ready to perform the ceremony. His voice rang out clear and strong as Grace reached the altar, where Mistress Willett placed her hand in Alistair's with a proud smile. "Dearly beloved," the bishop began, "we are gathered here in the sight of God." The couple spoke their vows with clear voices that carried to every corner of the chapel. When Alistair slipped the gold ring onto Grace's finger, his hands were steady at last. Their first kiss as man and wife was gentle and reverent, accompanied by the joyous pealing of bells from the castle tower that echoed across all of Kentmere. The great hall had been transformed for the wedding feast, with trestle tables groaning under the weight of winter delicacies. Noble ladies who had once scorned Grace now had to curtsy before her as she took her place at the high table, while their husbands bowed low to the new Duchess of Kentmere. The villagers raised toast after toast to the couple's health, and even the most disapproving nobles found themselves swept up in the celebration. As evening fell, Alistair led Grace up to the castle battlements. Torches blazed in iron brackets, casting warm light across the ancient stones. Hand in hand, they walked the walls of their home, pausing to look out over the moonlit countryside that was now their shared domain. "My love," Alistair murmured, drawing Grace close against the winter chill. "You have transformed not just my life, but the meaning of virtue itself." He pressed a kiss to her temple, his eyes bright with joy. What was once a lonely vow has become a covenant of love, blessed by both heaven and earth. Grace's answering smile outshone the torchlight as she squeezed his hand. Below them, the sounds of celebration drifted up from the great hall, while above, stars twinkled in the clear winter sky, bearing witness to a love that had overcome every barrier placed before it. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.